Growing up, I always felt like the outcast in my own home. I was a disobedient child, as my parents would say. I'm sure it seemed that way since my older brother, Brian, heeded their every demand. My whole life, I felt like I lived in his shadow, never fully amounting to the perfect bar he'd set for us. For that, he was constantly rewarded, and I was constantly shunned. As we grew older, Brian and I grew closer. He could tell our parents treated me differently, and I think it started to weigh on him. He saw my reluctance to conform as interesting and brave, but could never bring himself to stand up to our parents in the same ways. He tried his best when I was being scolded for average things, but the only time Brian's opinions mattered were when they matched those of our parents. You'd think this was something we'd all grow out of, especially our parents, but unfortunately, they stayed true to their beliefs that I should have amounted to more. I was never quite sure what more they wanted from me. I had become an entrepreneur in my early 20s, built successful businesses, was featured in several business magazines, yet they still thought I should have been married by now. Critics come with the spotlight, and I knew the bigger I grew my businesses, the more critics I'd have, but I never expected them to be my own parents. Even after all I had accomplished, the life I'd built for myself, and the fact that I never asked them for a thing past my 18th birthday wasn't enough. They always insisted I needed a man to share my success with, that I wouldn't be whole until I had a partner to marry. My parents were obsessed with the ideals of marriage. They themselves had gotten married at such a young age, and only for social validation. My mother saw this as a strategic move, and back then maybe it was, but these days such drastic measures weren't necessary. It's not that I refused dating. I dated. I enjoyed the company of men, sex, that honeymoon phase. Forcing connections wasn't in my wheelhouse, though, and I refused to settle down unless I felt something greater. Usually, parents want what's best for their children, whatever makes them happy. The way I had built my life was exactly the way I planned it. At 28 years old, I owned my own house, several businesses, a dog, and I had made some amazing friends who turned out to be closer than my family. None of this impressed my parents, though. Apparently, I could only be fulfilled with a husband by my side. The constant nagging almost made me half tempted to tell them I was a lesbian, just to stir the pot. They would have had a stroke. I'll admit their constant degradation didn't always settle well. I'd find myself internalizing their opinions, asking myself if I was really happy, if I was lonely, or if there was something wrong with me for not being married by now. They were beginning to convince me I was the problem. It had me feeling vulnerable at times. For example, when they hosted a birthday party for my brother's new wife. They hadn't hosted a birthday party for me since I was a kid. Brian had recently married a woman named Lydia. She was nice, but she always gave me a manipulative vibe, like she was an actress on set, always making sure she delivered her lines perfectly. It seemed strange, but I didn't judge her for it. It's hard not to feel put on the spot around people like my parents. When I walked in their house, I noticed a new picture hanging in the foyer. It was a canvas of Brian and Lydia on their wedding day, right next to the one of our parents on their wedding day. It felt like a creepy shrine they'd made for their remarkable accomplishments of marriage, and I was nowhere to be found. They hadn't even hung up my graduation pictures after I finished college. Between the newfound animosity I felt towards Lydia and the same old resentment my parents always stirred up, I was spiraling before I even got to the dinner table. I watched as my parents engaged with Lydia as if she was the daughter they wished they'd had. It was repulsive to me, and it crushed me to see the two people I had tried my hardest to make proud showering their new daughter in law with the love I always wished I'd felt from them. My brother was the only one to notice my fury. I stood up quickly and threw my napkin down, then walked out of the house. Brian followed me outside, but he knew why I needed to leave, and he didn't bother trying to stop me. He knew how toxic our parents had been growing up, and they still were. He knew my envy was not directed towards Lydia or him, and that I was truly happy for the bond they'd created. He knew my bitterness stemmed from my parents' expectations long ago, and we both realized in that moment that I had finally stopped caring. By distancing myself from my parents, I was able to clear my head. I realized I would never be able to change the way they saw me, but I could change the way I saw myself. Without their negativity, I was able to love myself fully and heal that inner child who had always felt so out of place. That same child who refused to fit their mold, the one who learned to change and evolve with the world around her. That inner child helped adult me to realize that family isn't always the home you're born into or the blood you share. It's the ones you choose along the way, the ones who love you for all that you are.